Now you're welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown podcast. We are the podcast that look at the stats, XG, and performance of Celtic FC. There's a lot to get into this week, as always is the case with Celtic these days. But we're going to start off with the main topic of the week, the Dubai trip. So 13 players forced to self-isolate after Christopher Julian test positive on return from Dubai. 13 first-team players plus Neil Lennon and assistant John Kennedy as well. Celtic's statement summed up in one paragraph for me. Whilst we were in Dubai, the announcements made on January 4th significantly changed the COVID landscape. The reality is that the case could have well occurred if we remained in Scotland, as other cases have done in Scotland and across UK sport in the past week. Nicola Sturgeon came out hard against Celtic, criticising them, saying that she didn't think that they were sticking to the proper protocols. Peter Lawwell announced yesterday in a statement, if you look back over the last 4 years, going to the camp in Dubai has been extremely successful, and the decisions made were entirely in the best interest of the team and the best interests of the club. What we planned to do was take them to the same facilities, which are world class, and after a hectic program in November and December, which had proven to be at great benefits to the team and their performance in January, to get to that performance level again. Juco James and Alan Morrison are on the line to discuss all of this. Lads, I think the general feeling that I'm getting from all this is that Celtic have washed their hands of any responsibility for this at all, and are essentially playing their cards in the sense that this could have happened in Scotland and we had permission to be there. So technically, we're not wrong in being there.
Yeah. So there's like a million things we can touch on here in terms of issues, but for me, there are a couple I'm going to kind of cover really, which fundamentally call into question in my mind the basic competency of the board. So when you board of directors, actually, it doesn't matter whether we're managing Topshop or HSBC or Celtic Football Club, right? The roles and responsibilities of that board are pretty much the same, right? That's why you have non-exec directors that can be pretty fungible, move and operate and oversee activities on different organisations, because fundamentally, the workings of a board and the considerations of a board are broadly similar in across many in all industries really. And one of the skills or competencies that you need as a board member and as a CEO is you really are the kind of moral compass of the firm. And to touch on the point you made, sometimes just because you can do something doesn't mean to say that you should. So because you've got sign off from the regulator to do something, you still have to ask yourself: is this the right thing to do for all of our stakeholders, for our brand, for our reputation, and for the benefit of the firm and the society that we operate in? Because no company is an island. The impact that you're having on society, especially for a football club, which is ingrained in society. These considerations are very important. And it fundamentally comes down to this: it wasn't the right thing to do. And the board fundamentally didn't come to that conclusion. Now, and this question of, oh, well, in the 4th of January, the situation changed, it won't wash at all, because any company, especially in the current situation, would have some kind of COVID crisis response, framework to put in place. Now, for example, the company I work for, we had daily executive level meetings when the whole thing kicked off in March last year, and then, of course, as you sort yourselves out, that cadence becomes less frequent. But I would have thought that for most companies, and certainly for Celtic, you would have some kind of at least weekly crisis response group meeting to say, what is the latest situation? Because things are changing very quickly. Peter Lawwell in his interview yesterday touched on the fact that, we got approval in November. But the point being is, you're constantly reviewing those decisions to say, has the world changed? Has the landscape changed? Have the risks changed? And I'll come on to risks in a moment. And fundamentally, they had. The situation was getting worse. All the signs were that lockdown restrictions were going to get worse. So although the approval was there, you've got to read the environment that you live in, and that is a key competency of the board. And they got it wrong, right? They got it wrong. And this comment about Celtic is the most impacted club. He's actually probably right. He's right if you look through the lens of financial. If you look through the financial lens, Celtic have probably lost more money than any other club. However, they're not. That doesn't mean to say they're the most impacted. It only means they're the most impacted through that lens. And that lens is hardly surprising, given that Lowell's an accountant. I don't really like accountants being CEOs, but here we are. It does happen. But there's a whole range of other lenses that, as a board member and as a director, you have to look at, including not just financial. So let me come on to the second thing, and this really worries me massively, which is the whole concept of risk management. Right? Risk management should exist in any company. Now, you may not be like a massive bank, a football club. It doesn't have a whole risk department and an army of people considering every individual risk competency. But nevertheless, it's a responsibility of the board to consider those risks. And really, it's a pretty standard framework. You think about what is it that could go wrong that is going to impact us? What's the likelihood of it going wrong? And if it does go wrong, what's the impact? And then finally, what are we going to do to mitigate it? Which could range from a whole host of issues, a whole host of measures, like we have done, no doubt, at training, where to combat the risk of players getting COVID, there'll be all sorts of measures put in place to mitigate those risks. To on the other hand, doing nothing and just waiting to see. And this comment that we have all these protocols in place to deal with player training and contact and so forth. You're going to a completely different environment, okay? You're mass transporting a large group of people over many, many hours. It's an 8-hour flight to Dubai, right? You're mass transporting people. The players don't live together. They probably don't travel to work together, but now they will be. They're in the building 24/7 together when at home they're not. The physical layout of the campus and of the training facilities will be fundamentally different. Celtic have control over all the ancillary staff at Lennoxtown, from the gate person to the grounds people to the catering staff to the masseurs to whatever. And that won't be the case in Dubai. You might get a bit of paper with a stamp on it saying, certified COVID, but fundamentally your risk profile has gone up massively. Mm-hmm. And also the risk profile is changing, over time, as I mentioned. So this statement about, with the benefit of hindsight, as if to say, well, it's all very well saying after the fact, but actually, if you were a risk manager and you were looking at, going to Dubai and you were saying, okay, well, what are the possible outcomes here? I would have thought, that even as a layperson, that the risk of one person contacting COVID would be significantly high. And actually, what has happened here isn't even the highest risk that could have happened. I would have said what has actually happened, where one person has become infected and then a corollary of around 15 people have been locked down because of that, would have been probably a medium risk. It would have been pretty likely actually to have happened. Mm-hmm. The worst case scenario would have been the complete shutdown of football operations, and we probably weren't too far from that in all honesty. So what level of risk management? And risk management isn't a one-time deal. I'm going to assess my risks because, as I mentioned before, within the framework of a board operating under these conditions, you should be reviewing these things on a weekly basis, saying, has the landscape changed? Has the guidance changed? Has the risk profile changed? Is it now more likely? And you'd looked at that, you'd have come to the conclusion, well, yes, it has. The situation is worsening. Is it really worth it? Mm-hmm. And then you've got to consider, what is the impact? What is the worst that could happen? What would be the financial impact of that? What would be the impact on our brand and on our reputation? Based on the things he said, these things don't seem to have even been considered. I mean, if you'd said, okay, we've done all this and we concluded, we're going to take the risk anyway and see what happens, you'd kind of think, well, at least you've thought about it and you've made a decision. I don't think they even thought about this. Yeah. There's the comments they've made. There's no evidence. And then finally, the aftermath of it, as you mentioned, the whole lack of self-awareness, it's just baffling from a sort of PR perspective. It's just absolutely awful. But fundamentally for me, I mean, James will no doubt pull up another 20 reasons why the board are incompetent. But those are the two for me that just absolutely scream. Just basic, fundamental, what you need a director to do for any company.
James, your thoughts on all this?
So the Alan eloquently referenced the risk side of the equation, and I think I agree 100% there. And actually, when I went on Celtic Underground back at the end of July, I talked a lot about Scott Brown at the time as a proxy for the analytical shortcomings that appeared to be on the horizon for the club, but towards I don't know, somewhere last quarter of the podcast, I talked a lot about risk and how the composition of factors that were aligning for the season increased risk dramatically. And I think, most human beings think in linear terms. So it's not natural for people to think in exponential math. That's why the pandemic has been so hard for people to grasp at times, which is, how do we go from, 5 people having cases, and then 3 weeks later, countries are in complete lockdown because it's spread so fast. And so that's when you think about system dynamics and complex systems in particular, non-linearity is a huge component to that. And what Alan just talked about on the risk side, that's the perfect example of that, where one person gets it, and you make one decision, and because of the non-linearity of the risk, not only do you have then 13 people, which could have been worse, isolating, you now have the feedback loop of financial risk that Alan talked about, which again, if you look at financial risk and operating leverage in a structure financially, that's nonlinear for the most part. It can be anyway, meaning that, if Celtic's season ticket renewals go from 50,000 to 35,000, the impact of that on cash flow is huge, right? We all of a sudden go from, player wage baseline of 32 million to maybe 18 million, right? Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily proportional. So the risk side, I agree with 100% with Alan. It's been a disaster all season. But what makes this worse in my mind is when you talk about risk, you usually also talk about reward, right? What's your unit of risk relative to the upside? And this comes back to the analytical competency or lack thereof, which is, this Hail Mary that a Dubai trip is the reason why we've outperformed relative to expectations post winter break in the last 4 seasons. And I tweeted about this, I think it was yesterday or the day before. It's like, I haven't done it, but you probably very simply do an analysis, a regression analysis of other clubs' wage budgets relative to their league, squad size, that type of thing. It only makes sense naturally that a club like Aberdeen, whose squad size and relative quality of that squad size is going to suffer as the season goes on due to injuries, due to workload, fatigue. And we saw that with Rangers last year, right? So I actually did it on Alan's website back on Celtic by Numbers back in June, which was looking at the factors of what really drove Rangers falling off a cliff in results post winter break. And a lot of it had to do with the lack of squad depth. Yeah. They had a cluster of injuries that they hadn't had in the first half of the season. And all of a sudden they had 4 or 5, of their most important players get injured. And so, when you have a deeper...
Sorry, Jen, Morelos stopped scoring and they didn't have an adequate backup option, didn't have that depth. Yeah.
Exactly. And Defoe was injured then. And you had Jack get hurt, and you had Davis get hurt, and Barisic get. I mean, you had some of their better players get injured. Whereas I think before break it was just the one winger, I forget his name even, that went out with the red card. So to me, this goes back to the modeling of and how do you really attribute performance and think about things analytically. And so, is there some impact? Of course, it's like the conversation we've had in the past about leadership and on the pitch and that type of thing. Of course, that has an impact. The question is, how do you measure it? Can you measure it? But more importantly, is it 20% of performance? Is it 50% of performance? What's if you're doing an attribution analysis, how do you attribute certain things to what drives performance? I would argue that the Dubai trip is a rounding error as to why the season played out the way it did the last few seasons post break. And it was vast, for example, last season, it was far more important that they switched McGregor into an attacking 8 role and gave Edouard a strike partner than they got some vitamin D while in Dubai.
Yeah, which you can get in tablet form. So you can
exactly
that.
Yeah. So the upside here was a Hail Mary. It was based off of a false premise that this was some magical way that we perform better, is to get a week in the sun, or in prior seasons 2 weeks in the sun. So when you put those two things together, it's just amazing. I keep coming back to this every time we talk about these issues, which it's just amazing the degree with which some of these decisions have been formulated and implemented and mishandled. The ramifications of this are still to come. This is going to continue to cascade the ramifications from the sequencing of bad decisions. So it's just incredible that this decision was made, given the context of everything else that's going on.
Yeah, it was absolutely insane. And I suppose looking at it from even just a footballing perspective, first of all, 19 points behind, like what Peter Law was saying that we did it in previous years, 19 points behind, you do not go to Dubai and go on a holiday and magically think that's going to change your season around. You're 19 points behind for a reason, because you're underperforming all of the different elements that we've talked about. Also, something that you touched on, Alan, that I wanted to touch on was the leadership. And how many people do you think this decision would have had to go through in order for it to happen? So you have the board, you definitely have Peter Lawwell involved in that, maybe Dermot Desmond, Neil Lennon, John Kennedy, and all of them, either nobody disagreed with going to Dubai, or nobody had the guts to stand up to whoever had the ultimate choice of going to Dubai to say that we're 19 points behind Rangers. There's a global pandemic going on. The fans are already protesting outside of the stadium. Maybe this is not a good idea. And then the implications of all of this, like you said, the risk management, the ultimate risk for this is that, for example, let's say, because we've seen a little bit of different variations of results coming out from these tests, and false positives, false negatives, all sorts of things. What happens if Celtic come back from this trip? Christopher Julian never tests positive. He gets a false negative test. He plays in that game against Hibs. Hibs all get COVID. Celtic all get COVID, and the entire season is over. That is what was at stake here, and that could have happened.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is a scenario that you've described that is not unreasonable. It's not a the moon crashes into the earth type of piece of risk management. It's actually a plausible scenario, and like you say, and as James eloquently said, what is the upside to this? Is it worth the risk, essentially? And in terms of the decision making, again, I keep coming back to the board of directors have got very specific duties and responsibilities. So this isn't a decision for Neil Lennon, for John Kennedy. They've got a view. They're a key stakeholder as far as law is concerned. Desmond's a key stakeholder, obviously, but this is a board member decision. This is these aspects of risk management are the responsibility of the CEO, the finance director, the head of operations, etc., the head of HR, or what have you. Head of HR, actually, I would have expected to have been making quite a lot of noises and have been very aware and scenario planning around exactly the things that you've mentioned, by the way.
Yeah. One thing to learn is that the HR do not work for the people, they work for the company. So if the company make the decision, the HR department might raise a few concerns about it, but ultimately the company makes the choice. Let's get into the actual footballing things, because it seems like forever that we've been actually able to talk about what's going on the pitch as opposed to what's going on off the pitch. So Celtic won, Hibernian won, late goal from Nesbitt to level it up after David Turnbull had given Celtic the lead from a fantastic free kick, you have to say. Celtic's lineup, I got a lot of stick on YouTube for referring to it as a B team, but I suppose maybe I was being a little bit flippant with that. But Hazard in goals, Duffy, Sorrow, Turnbull, Roderick, Johnson, Frimpong, McGregor, Harper, Welsh, and Laxalt. So, not the worst team in the world, to be honest. But let's get into things. Another set piece. What's going on?
Well, I think, for that particular set piece, I looked at it, and I'm not being smart with hindsight here. As soon as Laxalt made that foul, my heart sank. I honestly did. And then you looked at it, and you had effectively like a bunch of 11-year-olds lined up across the 6-yard box, and you're sort of thinking, this doesn't look good. So whether that particular set piece is a very good example to make generalizations about the season, I'm not so sure. But I think this game, go back to picking up on James's theme there of what's the upside. A tiny upside to this is that some players are going to get some exposure and some chances that otherwise wouldn't, and we might actually learn something, and we might actually save some money on maybe a couple of players breaking through that hitherto wouldn't. But I know you said this was still a strong squad, and on paper it does look like a strong team that was put out there. But I think this goes to highlight how fragile and how complex a football team system actually is. That you only need to have a couple of adverse selection problems, like, for example, playing with no striker, and a couple
in a two-striker system.
In a two-striker system, and then I actually wasn't sure what formation they were. I'll be honest with you, I couldn't. I still, having watched it twice now, I couldn't tell you what formation they were playing.
Agreed.
But it also highlights how fragile Celtic's squad actually is to stand up to any sort of challenge. Hibs are not a good side, as we've talked about on this podcast a while. The rest of the SPFL, outside of one club who've had to cut their cloth accordingly because of the situation that everybody's in, are all weaker than they were last season. Some teams like Livingston or Ross County, a bad example, but might be like a tiny bit. You could probably make a case for saying they've improved a wee bit, but in terms of challenging Celtic, this would have been like a free ride. Beat Rangers pretty much, and you'd have wrapped it up. So Hibs are not a great team, but yeah, you could see that it took Celtic at least 20 minutes to get organised, and in that time, Hibs had 5-6 corners. Every single one looked like it could have caused trouble. They had a few shots on goal. The overall XG for the game was awful. It was like 1.9 to Hibs to 0.5 for Celtic. I mean, we did well to get out of this, because pretty much all of our chances were shots outside the box. So although there were 6 shots on target, 10 shots in total, there was really none from what I'd call the sort of danger area, like 0. And then there was like a few that were wide angle in the box that were kind of poor choices. So it wasn't great. I think that you can't be overcritical, because some of these kids, I think, and we'll maybe come on to some of the individual performances in a minute, but I think there's perhaps certainly one that I would pick up on. But playing without a striker, that is what it's like. That is a great example of, you can play a false 9 system if that false 9 is messy. That will work, right? But when that false 9 is a little skinny kid who honestly looks like he needs help, wiping his nose, then it's not gonna work, and you're not gonna get the runs made. You're not going to get the contact in the box. You're not going to get people moving the defenders out of position. There's just any basic competent striker would have been able to do, and that was the most glaring reason, I think, that Celtic had such little attacking threat in the game.
Well, one of the things to think about when it comes to this game as well is that you don't want to be overly harsh on the players who are out there, because even though it is a fairly okay team, not the best team that you can obviously put out, the team that would have been preparing for Hibernian for the game would have been preparing in a system in Dubai. So all of these players were sort of just throwing onto the pitch, and it was, okay, you're playing this system, you need to work this out by yourself, which seems like a theme throughout the season, even when they do have time to prepare. James, what did you think of the game?
Yeah, it was an eyesore, basically. That's what I think of the game. It was brutal to watch. But yeah, for someone like Cameron Harper, shout out to another American making their debut for Celtic. For him to be making his debut under these circumstances, with playing a role that, again, I don't even know what the role was. I looked at his heat map just out of curiosity, and it's all over the place. Everywhere from the corners to on both sides of the pitch. Again, so maybe he moved around. Maybe it was a fluid system. I don't know. And so that's just brutal. I mean, what a difficult situation to walk into. I mean, if he was the nominal striker or one of the two nominal strikers, I mean, you could kind of see at times maybe a 4-2-3-1 with Turnbull out wide at times and Harper kind of a striker, maybe sort of. So, I mean, that's just brutal. And so the one thing I did want to say is I thought Welsh, you know, I'm still skeptical on Welsh. I don't think he really profiles as a European level Celtic center back. You know, I think given his size, you know, I'm a little skeptical on that. But I thought he was excellent. I thought for the circumstances, he really played a really good game. And even Duffy up until the free kick, I thought Duffy for him.
This is his best game, yeah.
Yeah, I thought Duffy was okay. I mean, it was really unfortunate. That's the free kick. My favorite proxy for the free kick was Laxalt. I've watched the free kick, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times. And the comedy value of just focusing on Laxalt's pretty high. If anyone wants to try it, I mean, he kind of marks a guy, and until the ball gets kicked, and then he just runs around, like he literally just runs around like a puppy does, you know, kind of incoherently, not really knowing what they're doing. It's amazing. And you know, obviously we had the three of them go to the line instead of coming out to cover Nisbet. So yeah, so in a really tough spot against maybe the fourth or fifth best team in the league, you know, trying to play a system with guys that haven't played together. I mean, that's the other thing I think fitness wise. I mean, these younger players haven't had a season. I mean, they're in training, but they're not match fit. They've barely been playing. Yeah. Or if they've been playing, it's some kind of internal bounce games or something, theoretically. I mean, there's barely been any kind of...
I think there's been two maybe reserve games or Glasgow Cup games possibly. I mean, Harper had cramp in 57 minutes. Now, a cramp isn't an injury. It's a conditioning failure, actually. It's a failure to condition properly. And listen, he's a kid. I mean, he wasn't physically ready to play that game. And it was astonishing because Okoflex came on, who looked quick, mobile, strong, held the ball up quite well, went into challenges. And you sort of think, who made that decision that Harper should start over Okoflex? That in itself is a stunning decision on that basis.
I really wish I had my Photoshop skills ready when I saw the pictures appearing of him wearing his AirPods and just listening to us harper on about shape and. You know, I don't think that's what he was. I think it was Neil Lennon apparently he was listening to when he was going on. But yeah, in terms of this game, like I mean, there's a big difference between match fitness and training. Anybody who has played any sport or football in particular will know that you can be as fit as a fiddle and you go onto a pitch and you're blowing within 10-15 minutes because it's a different kind of conditioning. You're constantly up and down, lowering your heart rate all the time. In terms of, you mentioned Welsh there, Alan, any particular standout performances for you?
Yeah, I think James absolutely spot on with Welsh. I like Welsh. I like him. So in terms of the game, just to put into context, what does a good performance look like for him? He made 10 successful challenges, intercepts, and only lost one. Duffy actually won all of his challenges. It was easily Duffy's best game until that moment at the end. Welsh had 19 recoveries, which is second only to Sorrow. He made eight clearances, which is easily the most in the team. Making a clearance isn't necessarily a positive, but what it indicates to me is it backs up my sort of qualitative assessment of Welsh, which is that he's an uncomplicated defender. He doesn't overcomplicate the game like Duffy does. He keeps the game very simple. He plays it safe. It's something that Kieran Tierney always did. People don't focus on Tierney's defensive skills so much, but Tierney's main asset as a defender, apart from his recovery pace, was that he didn't overcomplicate the game. He kept it very simple, and as a result, he made very few errors. And Welsh similarly, and actually, also the Hibs put a lot of pressure on him. Their default ball was the diagonal to him in Frimpong's position, which a lot of teams do. And he was up against Nisbet, who is the highest scoring striker in the league, right? And it was a really good prospect. So I think that was a standout performance from Welsh. And as I say, because of both the qualitative and to a lesser extent the quantitative, which we don't have a lot of data on him, I'm actually quite hopeful about Welsh. And in fact, for me, if we play the rest of the season, given that Julian isn't going to be back, if we play the rest of the season with a combination of Welsh and Ayer, I'd be pretty excited to see that, actually.
We might need to get used to playing Welsh there anyway, because I mean, Duffy is essentially gone, and maybe Chris Julian has played his last game in a Celtic kit because of, well, firstly, he's out for at least a couple of months with his knee injury, and then sure, who knows what happens after that.
So just on, sorry, I don't go backwards, but if I was Chris Julian, and I'd be really surprised if he's not taking legal advice at this time. I'd be very surprised.
Well, that is something that could potentially happen, because I mean, it's the decision making off the board. Maybe he didn't approve of going, but I mean, it complicates the whole matter that he, in personal choice, you can choose not to go, you can choose to leave early, like Duffy did essentially. But James, anything for you from this game that you want to touch on in terms of the stats, XG, or whatever?
Yeah, the other part, this comes back to the coaching question, and I think the game on Monday was more so an opportunity issue. I mean, that we didn't get into positions. It's not like I didn't think the decision making was terrible, like it had been in the derby, where people were shooting and passing up good opportunities to pass. I think these were more desperation shots because that's about all we could get. But it goes back to for example, Soro had a shot that was actually a pretty good shot from range. That was the one thing. If you look at we'll say the post shot XG of the long distance shooting, we actually were pretty good shooting from distance in this game. So we put an unusual number on goal and actually, made their keeper make some saves. But if you look at somebody like Soro, this is where I get concerned about philosophy and coaching. You look at a player like Soro's track record prior to Celtic. I don't think he had scored a goal in
one goal.
Was it one? Yeah.
One, yeah.
And his number of shots were very low. He's a defensive midfielder. He plays fairly deep, and his job is not to shoot. And I can see him, and particularly the way he reacted to scoring that goal, and the dynamic between him and Lennon. I could envision a conversation where they've been encouraging him to shoot more. And right, Alan, I just, and maybe he's the greatest long range shooter in the history of the world, but why has no one identified this before now?
At 4 different clubs in 4 different countries and 4 different languages, no one thought to think,
Right. So, almost it's like someone who's starts gambling for the first time. Or you see this in, people that get involved in financial markets, trading stocks or something like that, or currencies. One of the worst things you can do is make a lot of money early because then you think you know what you're doing instead of it having been luck or randomness, and you lose everything. So, the fact that Soro has scored on a long range shot, and now the second one, which was a good shot. I mean, it required a good save. It looked like it was going in. I shudder when I see this. I'm like, are we going to start seeing Soro shooting 3 times from 30 yards every game, and encouraged to do so, which, again, probably wouldn't be a good idea. So that was the other thing that struck me is in coming out of that game was I saw him shoot again. I was like, oh boy, we don't want to see this become a pattern.
Yeah. Let's move on to big picture things then, because we've spoken about a lot about what could have happened, what potentially might have been the fallout from the Dubai trip. The realistic, real life fallout from this is that Celtic had to play with a depleted squad. They drew against Hibs. Essentially, if they wanted to win the league, they had to win every single game from now until the end of the season. That didn't happen, so they're not going to win the league. Rangers are going to win the league. So we'll put that to bed. But it's been 10 years. It's been a decade. We've spoken a lot about the sort of long-term regression of this Celtic team in Europe. What about domestically? What are we expecting from Celtic over the next 3, 4, 5 years? Because you mentioned the financial impact and what Peter Law is thinking of. Celtic, I actually looked at the books when they were published. 70 million in profit last year. That's depleted now. It's only a couple of 100,000. So it's a 70 million hit that Celtic have taken. They have a lot of assets that will be a lot worth a lot less next year, considerably a lot less next year, and considerably a lot less than they were last year because of the way that the market has fallen over the last year. So, Alan, your thoughts on the next couple of, or James, I think you want to jump in here.
I just wanted to throw, because there was and I had commented on this Twitter this week, was the Dembele move to Madrid, Atletico, and the terms of that were a loan with an option to buy. And if you looked at the rumor mill back in, I think it was September and October, about what Milan was looking to do with Ayer, was a loan with an option to buy. And if you could, think about this in consumer terms, it's almost like a seller financing scheme. It's like going to buy a car and them offering you a loan to buy something that you can't afford up front. You can't pay cash for it. And given what's going on and this second round with the new variant of the virus, and what this might mean as we head into the end of this season, if leagues can finish, and what it looks like for early next season, there are and I talked about this last week. The risks here in the transfer market are substantial. That who knows what the terms are going to be when we look to sell some of these players, and given the asymmetry of the risk reward decision making that we talked about at the beginning of the show, whatever future plans are in the pipeline, they're being laid out by the people that have been making these decisions. So when I look at the next 3 to 5 years, it's a question of, model, what's the structure, and then who are the people deploying it, and then what are the just the financial resources. And I think the ultimate result of this season, we're going to come out of it with, at best, financial parity with Rangers. So we've gone in a period of 12 months from close to 40 million on the balance sheet, and you could argue upwards of 80 million plus in players, to the cash gone, and the news broke this morning my time, of the furloughing of the under 18s, and they put in a $13 million line of credit. I would be surprised if they're going to tap into that now with what's going on, if they don't sell anyone in this window. And we have all this risk of, the issues with the support and season ticket renewals, and whether people are going to get into grounds next season. What's the value proposition there? So I suspect Rangers aren't going to have a problem if they win the league, which, as you said, it's probably 99% probable now. And they have a fair crack at Champions League money now as well. Mm-hmm. This is a complete reset in the financial landscape on a competitive basis. And this has all been done in 12 months. And a lot of it has been due to bad decision-making at Celtic. As well as, again, in fairness to Rangers, on the footballing side, some better decision-making.
Yeah.
So the next 3 to 5 years is back to the future, back to a league where, I would be surprised if we go into next season as favorites. In fact, I would think we'll probably be fairly significant underdogs in a 2-team league effectively. And there's a chance that our wage budget, and unless we get outside capital, unless somebody's going to pony up a check in a share offering or something like that, it wouldn't surprise me if we have a smaller wage bill than Rangers, and that we go towards a youth movement. And who knows who the director of football, when they go to that model, is going to be, as it's rumored to be. It's going to happen, and who's the manager that comes in. I mean, there's just so many moving parts now. Whereas we're in relative chaos, whereas, on the other side of the city, I see a plan. I see a plan being executed, and they gambled financially, but sometimes, that pays off, and it looks like it may in this instance.
Yeah, and just on that, because Rangers, it's a basic money principle. A basic gambling principle is essentially you have to spend money to make money, and Celtic have not spent money over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I've spoken about this before. They didn't, for me, do their risk reward strategy correctly if they thought that not spending money would be enough to stay in the Champions League. And ultimately, that's where clubs are making their money. That's why the super clubs are remaining the super clubs. And that's why everyone playing in the Champions League are doing better than everyone else, because the money involved in that is astronomical. And Celtic didn't think about that. They didn't think that maybe if we don't invest in the squad properly, that we won't be in this competition forever, and that money will not be there forever. And who knows the next time Celtic are going to be back in the Champions League. And to get there, you need to spend money. And to spend money, you need to have a little bit of money. And Celtic don't have any money anymore. That's where we're at.
I sort of task myself with thinking about the question, is this the end of an era? Is this like the end of Celtic's sort of dynasty and hegemony over Scottish football? Is this strategically actually the end of that period? And I think if you think about all the scenarios about why do football club hegemonies end, Celtic don't fit any of those models. So if you look at, for example, some teams just get old together. The team physically ages and declines. Manchester United were a classic example of that in the early 1970s, where the European Cup winning team from '68 all got old together, Charlton and Law and so forth, and they ended up getting relegated by 1974. Barcelona are going through that exactly the same time. They gave long contracts to the likes of Piqué and Busquets and so forth, and they've now got aging players in key positions that they can't ship. They've got no resale value. And then you think about other scenarios. Have we done a Leeds in '74 and brought in a Clough? I mean, whatever you might say about Lennon, he did win. He has won 3 trophies, and he's hardly a sort of a stretch for the club culturally. He's not like Souness at Liverpool in '91, who completely destroyed everything that's been built up over the last 15 years. You could argue, Van Gaal at Man United was just a complete cultural misstep. We've not had sudden disaster. Busby Bays, the Torino team of '49. We've not had like a key person suddenly, leave. We don't have any one key person risk. So if you think about, Ferguson leaving Manchester United, that's irrecoverable almost. James will be able to speak to American sport, but that's the key risk in most American sports. NBA teams are obviously very small, right? When the best player retires, the dynasty tends to end. Mm-hmm. In football, in American football, when the quarterback retires, the good run comes to an end. I don't know about baseball because I don't count that as a sport. It could be. We've not seen. I think we will see a bit of an exodus, but it's not like these teams that are built up that are excellent, and then suddenly all the players leave at the same time. It happened to Everton in the 1980s. It happened to Ajax in the mid 90s. It happened to Porto when Mourinho left. We're not in that scenario either. We're not even overreaching. To your point, we're not doing a Leeds United. We're not doing a Rangers under Murray. So what this is actually a story of underreaching and of arch conservatism. One of the most, frustrating things that Lowell's ever said was that piece that Phil McGillivray reported, and it was a personal conversation that he was reporting. So it was a direct quote that when the Rangers liquidation, started to become reality, Lowell's response to that was, "This has cost us £5 million a season." That was his response. Again, accountant. All he's thinking about is the bottom line. And I think there are. I think that what we saw under Ronnie Dyler wasn't Dyler's fault in terms of closing that tier. I think the reality was there's probably around 5,000 season ticket holders who won't renew if they're not playing in Old Firm games. And do you know what? Good riddance to them, as far as I'm concerned. What I've never understood about this is, for me, and you mentioned it, Enda, about the Champions League money. Surely, I get that Celtic would be £5 million a year poorer by not having a Rangers around to compete against and the Old Firm dollar, etc. But surely having a free run at Champions League money for all those years would make up for that more. What I think has happened is typical Low. He wants his cake and he wants to eat it. He wanted depressed, subjugated Rangers to keep those 5,000 people renewing the season tickets, to get that 5 million extra in TV money. Andy thought he was going to get a free run at the Champions League money, but they haven't actually set themselves up to do that. And perhaps it's taken them by surprise that the lot across the city have gambled to such an extent as they have. And I kind of slightly disagree with James on that one, because they are absolutely built on sand. And there has to be a reckoning at some point. There has to be a reckoning, but that nevertheless we have dropped the ball. And I think if it is an end of an era, it's not for the reasons that normally football clubs come to the end of their dominance. It's because it's actually the opposite of many of those reasons.
There might be a reckoning for them. Like, it could come in the same form as it came last time, or it could, like James say, it could work out for them, because basically what football clubs build themselves on, and what the Manchester United model has been for years now under the Glaziers, and even the Liverpool model to an extent, has been built on waging debt on
highly leveraged,
leveraging that debt and bringing in money later on. And that's what Rangers are essentially promising. If we spend all this money, Champions League will be there for us over the next couple of years, and we will be able to pay that back.
So I'll use a financial world analogy here. So the difference with Rangers this time is, they're more analogous to a country like the United States that's issuing their own debt in their own currency. So all of their debt, for the most part, is internally held. They've been converting it. So that's why, and I didn't quite understand the dynamics of this back in the spring until I really looked into it. Again, looking for things to do during lockdown. So I kind of changed my view on their path financially at that point, because, they're going to be able to endow their financial situation by making Champions League. And, again, they do have valuable players. They're not as valuable as an Edouard or theoretically a McGregor, although after the season, who knows? But they're going to be able to get a decent price for Barisic, and even Tavernier. I mean, they probably should look to sell him after the season, given his age and decline profile and the kind of season that he's had. So, if they get 30 million from Champions League and they can raise another 20 or 25 million in selling players, again, I've looked at their financial statements. That's enough. That's enough for them to basically get to the point of being a going concern, an operating model where they're not having to finance externally. And that's the difference. When you're in Argentina and you have to borrow money in US dollars, that's the analogous of what happened to Rangers back in the noughts, which is they borrowed money from banks. And that's, when you have creditors that are going to assert creditor powers, then that's where you come into a problem. But they simply don't have that dynamic. So again, that's where the irony of all this is, we may come out of this and it could be Celtic with the one that's drawn a bank line. This is what I'm saying. The degree of this, it's like Bizarro World in 12 months, just flipping it completely upside down. And so again, I suspect what Celtic's board is expecting is that they're going to be able to raise enough through player sales to basically bail them out. And that's why I keep coming back to this. Well, yeah, they're going to be able to sell them, but boy, I tell you, if I was somebody looking to buy Celtic players right now, I would be drooling. I would be drooling at my negotiating leverage as this is going into the last 18 months of the Big Four.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, James. I don't disagree with any of that, but it does work both ways, right? I mean, Celtic are still relatively a large club, and that works both ways in terms of their dealings with smaller clubs, unfortunately. So, but I take your point. I mean, in terms of the impact on the bottom line, in terms of bringing money in and financing a rebuild, which is, I mean, listen, a rebuild is on the cards because I don't think we'll keep any of the loan players, frankly, and it's likely that the likes of Incham, probably Edouard, probably Christie, probably Ayer, even, are going to be, from a career development perspective, looking to be on their way, and that leaves you with a core. Right, a core of, I'm going to say Barkas because he's an experienced goalkeeper, Julian, Turnbull, McGregor, Forrest. That's you've got to build a skeleton around that. Now there are some, promising young players there, Frimpong, Taylor's only 23, Johnson's 21, Sorrow's 22. Klamala's only 22. Jetty's only 23, believe it or not. So there's a core of younger players there, but you're going to need 6, 7 experienced players to trade in to get back to a solid level. So
yeah,
it's going to be a tough ask.
Well, and that's the issue is the structure. That's what I said earlier. The structure and the people deploying the plan here, as far as what's this rebuild going to look like, and what's the model, and all of that introduces significant risk. Whereas it looks like Rangers have already done that. They already have their model. They already have Wilson in place. They're already kind of a well-oiled machine to a degree, whereas we're kind of in the reconstitution phase. And it might happen. I mean, from the ashes, right, rises the phoenix. So we're certainly burning it down. But that introduces risk. So if they make good decisions from here, put smart people in control, and have a vision and a model, and move forward from there, there will be resources. I'm not saying there won't be resources, but it's an issue of the margin for error. And the risk, back to this conversation of risk, you're introducing risk, and the resources aren't going to be as high as they should have been. Certainly, probably a large degree smaller than they expected. How this would all play out. So, that's why I go back. If you think about the next 3 to 5 years, to me, it's very dicey. I think there's the call it the expected value range, so I could see things working out great. Rangers are going to have some disruption when Gerard eventually leaves. And there's risk then when that happens.
If he takes Beal with him, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And maybe Wilson gets a better job somewhere, gets attracted somewhere, or, so that there's obviously bilateral risk here. It's just that right now, particularly over the next 2 years, it looks like, Celtic's facing a lot more. And that means there could be upside there if things break right, but it could also get really bad if they don't make good decisions, which again, this goes back to why the last 12 months are so concerning, as we've kind of spiraled into so many bad decisions.
I'm going to finish this off with another phrase, sort of like your Phoenix phrase, James.
Yes.
Through adversity comes opportunity. And if Celtic can get, as you said, there's a long shot, if they can get right people in the right frame of mind that know what they're doing. A football director, I think, is absolutely key to all of this. Not that it's going to solve all the problems, but I do think it will be getting a person in there that knows the footballing world makes a lot bigger difference when it's changing from Peter Lawwell making football decisions to a football person who understands the market and understands the game making the decision. So hopefully, and we will do a podcast on what is going to happen and what players are leaving, and all those kind of things. We'll touch on that in a little bit more depth as the week goes on. Before we finish up, I do want to say I did say that there was exciting news coming for the Huddle Breakdown podcast. We are joining the 20-minute Tim's podcast on their Patreon page once a month, every month for the next 6 months until the end of the season. We'll have a podcast on their Patreon page anyway. So that is the news. We'll announce it on social media as well. So thanks to everyone who has listened to this point so far. And if you want to join and listen to us on the 20-minute Tim's Patreon, you can sign up to their Patreon page as well. Until next week, until the next time we have to deal with another Celtic crisis, Juco, James and Alan Morrison, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
We'll chat to you later.